Hello and welcome to today's technique tutorial. My name is Samantha Wiltshire and I'm going to be discussing stippling, scribbling and circling with you today. Here on my front slide, you'll see that I have one of my own works. This is Electricity Self-Portrait. It's charcoal on paper and I've used scribble and erasure. I've lifted with my eraser out of the charcoal in this instance to create the feeling of waves or channels of electricity. So I wanted them to be flowing. I wanted them to connect to one another. And so Scribble allowed me to do that in the most accessible way. To start with an overview of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be discussing some materials you'll need for these activities and some work health and safety considerations related to them. We're going to be going over our goals and objectives for this lesson. Then we're going to be introduced to stippling, circling and scribbling one at a time, and we're going to take a brief look at the variety of different ways that artists have applied these techniques. We're also going to be doing a practical exercise today where we attempt each of these techniques together, and then we'll be selecting our preferred technique out of the ones that we've tried, and we're going to be applying that to a really simple object or drawing. We've got a tree construction today that we can build upon with these techniques, but you can use anything at home in your space that you feel comfortable creating a construction drawing of. And then we're going to be talking about how you can continue in your own time to reinforce these activities and these skills moving forward. So what you'll need in terms of equipment for this activity, you're going to need either a sketchbook where you can replicate our boxes on my page and our tree construction, or you may just like to actually print out these slides and use the provided diagrams and areas for drawing, which are in these slides. In terms of your drawing equipment, you can choose whichever drawing material suits you best today. You might like to use a fine line pen, a pencil, charcoal, even things like pastel are great if you're feeling like delving into some color today. Just be aware that if you're using anything with a powdery consistency like charcoal or pastel, that we don't want to be blowing the excess dust in our studio space and making those particles airborne. They're not great to breathe in. Also, if you're using a material which will require you to fix it with a spray fixative, you're going to want to make sure that you're in a well-ventilated space and preferably outdoors to apply that spray. You may also like today to use a hard and a kneadable eraser if you are using a medium which you can erase. And you also might like to use a mole stick if you're afraid that you might be smudging your drawing by accident with your wrist today. If you're not sure what a mole stick is, you might like to refer back to our video on smooth rendering where we outline some of those different tools in a little bit more detail. The objectives for today's lesson are to understand what stippling, scribbling and circling are and how to differentiate between them. We also want to understand how these techniques have been applied across different mediums historically and how it might benefit our own art making to consider them for our practice. And these skills are really useful for some of the following reasons. First of all, they provide you with options when you're introducing tonal work to a piece. So rather than only relying on smooth rendering, that's really limiting. We want to have a whole variety of different tools in our tool belt that we can draw from when we're trying to create a resolved artwork. These techniques also demonstrate the range of possibilities for mark making and hopefully might provoke some further experimentation from you. So potentially from seeing the variety of different methods, you might invent your own, you might think of ways to push them further. And so you might be able to help to incorporate some new unique techniques that are going to separate your style from other people in your industry. And also these techniques are going to allow you to describe a greater variety of textures and patterns in your art making, and also hopefully to communicate a variety of different conceptual ideas, similarly to my electricity piece that maybe you wouldn't have been able to so easily communicate using only smooth rendering. So stippling, scribbling, and circling really matter because even though they've been around for a long time, they are all examples of ways in which artists have experimented with unique strategies for making marks and applying tone. As artists, we operate in an industry where most of our rules are bendable or breakable. And so it's important to understand that anything you can do with your materials is valid so long as you are satisfied with your outcome and so long as it's the most appropriate choice for your purposes and for what you're intending to communicate. Starting with stippling today, first of all, what is stippling? Stippling is a technique which is characterized by bouncing or placing your material against the page or canvas in order to create dots. In stippling, areas of tone or color are created using this process, which results in the overall image. A good comparison might be to think about how many tiny pixels make up a digital image on your screen. And that's kind of what we're trying to physically replicate with our drawing or painting materials. So stippling is a very versatile technique. We can use it in drawing, we can use it in etching and printmaking, we can use it in painting. We've got a whole variety of options. And also in digital art making as well, if you're interested in digital drawing. And many contemporary artists utilize stippling as a technique. So here on the right, we have a lovely example by Pablo Gerardo Ruiz. This is Nomads 2 from the Nomads series. It's black ink on paper. And you can see, especially if you zoom in, I wonder if we can. Yes, we can. You can see that each of these tiny little dots, it not only describes the tonal work, it's also been used as a form of patterning as well. And repetition in itself, I know it sounds silly, but repetition is an artistic technique in itself. So whether it was dots or something else, if you're repeating the same sort of mark making over and over again to create your final effect, that's a completely valid artistic technique. And particularly if you're in our diploma or advanced diploma program, you can talk about repetition in answering our workbooks when you're discussing your work. It is also important to be aware that for all of the benefits that stippling might bring to our art making, there are also some limitations. In particular, stippling is very labor intensive. It's very time consuming, especially if you're doing it on quite a large scale. So here we have another example of some stippling. This is by Xavier Casalta. This is his Portraits from the 19th and 20th Century series. And he gives some statistics about how labor intensive his stippling process is. The information he's given us on his website is that this series, which consists of more than just these two artworks, there's a whole variety of them, this series took him 50 to 90 hours and consists of 1.5 million plus dots, which is just amazing to think about the level of effort that he's gone through. The artist uses pen and other drawing materials to create this portraiture series. And we can see here that in this image, they're using their fine point pen to create these dots. And here's some more by that first artist we looked at together, by Ruiz. This is a full portrait and a close-up detail of that portrait so we can see these dots. This work is called Top Knot. It's from the CMYK Cyan, Yellow, Magenta, and Black collection. He's used these colors specifically in order to create the final work. And so these are all tiny dots of acrylic paint on canvas. And so we can see that this is a transferable skill. It's not just a drawing skill. It can most certainly be a painting skill as well. And it is a form of optical illusion. So when we look at it up close, again, it looks very pixelated and very digital. But when we look at it from a distance, it really does come together and become a nice complete rendering of a face. What's also interesting is that cyan, yellow, and magenta are the primary colors that we often use in digital art. So oftentimes that will be the ink that you're putting in your printer to be able to print an image. And that's often what images are constructed of when we look at digital pictures. So he's kind of replicated this but using his paint and his painting techniques. Here's a lovely engraving example. This is by Dura. And in this example, we can see not only stippling actually, but also hatching and a variety of other repetitive types of mark making and directional line work. And so this is a great example of the fact that we can combine these techniques to create some really, really interesting and dynamic finished results. So here we've got some sections of stippling. If we come down here, we can see some diagonal directional lines that help us to describe the fabric. So that's some hatching over there. We can see some dashes as well as just dots in various different areas, all different types of patterning. Here's some lovely vectors that draw our attention towards the light. And we can see again more directional lines, nice horizontal ones that help us to see that that's a flat ocean area back there. So all of these different types of mark making really assist us in being able to help our viewer see which area is which, what is that area made of, what is its texture, and what direction does it travel in. Now let's briefly discuss what is and what isn't stippling, because a lot of art making incorporates dots. We also see dots in the pointillism painting movement and in pop art as well. And we've got an example of pop art here. This is Lichtenstein's Explosion. It's a lithograph on paper, and we can see that he's used dotting to help describe these areas of smoke. So it could be argued that in the case of both pointillism and pop art, this is also stippling, but those boundaries are really unclear and other people might disagree. So dots have been used since really early in human history for a whole variety of purposes. And this ranges from decoration through to storytelling and even spiritual expression. Dotting is used in particularly Indigenous communities as well globally, but especially here in Australia. And it's really important that we keep that incredibly long and rich history of using dots in art making in mind when we're producing our own work. We want to be really clear when we're using dots about why we're using them, how we're using them, and how our audience might interpret them. So we want to make sure particularly that we're being culturally respectful when we do so. And I would encourage you to form your own opinion. All right. So what is and isn't stippling to you, and does it even actually matter? Now let's take a little bit of a look at circling or circulism. Circling or circulism is an artistic technique where tone is applied, or color, using many overlapping circle shapes with our pencil or whichever drawing material we might be using. This technique is often applied quite loosely and could be considered a tidier alternative to building tone using something like scribble, which we'll look at in a minute. Circulism is also, it's more contained, it's a little bit easier to control than scribble. And although this technique is typically applied to drawing materials, it also could be translated to really any other form of art making. And we have another example here. This is Maggie Toole's Hands 2. It's colored pencil on board. And you'll notice that it feels very soft. It feels very dreamlike. Using this technique, it can be a little bit more difficult to create a nice, strong, sharp edge. And so this artist has just really embraced that and really made that a part of the atmosphere of her work. And so that's definitely something to consider for yourself, depending on what subject matter you're trying to depict and what sort of a feeling you're trying to create. You might like to consider your ability to portray hard and soft edges and the overall clarity that you might be able to achieve with your chosen technique. And now we've got scribbling. So scribbling is exactly what it sounds like. So if you imagine scribble, I'm sure you're imagining a small child just playing with some textures or some crayons or some pencils. And although it seems almost silly, scribbling is actually a very mature artistic technique which a lot of contemporary artists use. It's not something which is strictly limited to describing the work of a child. We can also scribble as artists. And when we scribble, Really what we're doing technically is we're using randomized and expressive mark making. It's very gestural, it's very free, and we're really tapping into the emotional side of what it is that we're doing as artists. So it has a very free and childlike quality, but remembering, of course, that we're thinking about it in terms of being a mature artistic technique. And we can see that that's exactly what Ahmet's done in this artwork over here. It's very free. It has a childlike quality. It has a playfulness, but there's also a seriousness about it. And it's also very technically strong and well resolved. But you don't actually have to use it in a mature way if you don't want to. You might like to really feed into the juvenile quality of scribble, or you might want to do something which isn't so representational, like a portrait. You might like to do something completely abstract with your scribble. And we see all different types of scribble making its way into the contemporary art scene. And what we're doing when we're using scribble is we're thinking about the role of control in art making. So when we think about scribble, we're thinking about relinquishing control as an author. Not totally when we're scribbling by hand, but there is an element of unpredictability. There's an element of going with the flow and having to accept that whatever will be as the artist. And more we're starting to play with that in the contemporary context. And in fact, contemporary drawing is sometimes only even partially made by the artists themselves. And a fantastic example of this is Tim Knoll's MK3 postal project, in which he posted this drawing machine, which he built in the post. And as it shifted in the post between countries, this weighted machine in here, it slid around inside this box and it created this final drawing, which acts as kind of like a representation or even a map of this object's travels in the post. And so what he's causing us to think about is whether or not the artist is actually the author, whether the postal service is the author, whether the machine itself is the author, where are the boundaries? These are the sorts of interesting questions that we're now grappling with in drawing as artists today. So now what we're going to do is we're going to give it a practice. So you can print this slide off and you can use it for yourself. You can choose whichever material you would like to choose for this particular technique. I'm going to be using a fine line pen today in order to fill in these boxes. In the first, we're going to do stippling, then scribbling, circling, and then you're going to invent one. You're actually going to have a go at experimenting for yourself today. And what we'll do in each box is we will make a gradient from light to dark using this material. So unlike with just pencil, you may not always be able to rely on pressure to help you describe tone. So if you do use pencil today, you can. Pressing harder will create a darker result. But if you're pressing something with something like pen, you may actually find that rather than it being about your pressure on the material, it's going to be about building gradually for you today. And that's something that you'll notice in a minute when I demonstrate. All right, so now we've talked about stippling, scribble, circling, and other types of expressive tonal work techniques. Let's have a little bit of a go at it ourselves. What I've got here is a fine line pen. You can use a fine line pen like me if you'd like, or you can use a pencil. But either way, before you get started, just be aware of your material's capacity. So in terms of fine line pen, what I can do is I can build really easily, but it's very difficult to take away. I also have a little bit less control in terms of building by applying more pressure. So in works where I'm using pencil, I can press really firmly to make my mark darker. In pen, I might have some capacity to do that, but it's going to be a bit more limited. So let's have a little bit of an experiment. Let's make a vortex over here, little tonal vortex. So I'm going to start from really, really dark, and I'm going to lift gradually, and let's see how much control I have. There we go. So a little bit, but not a lot of control in terms of making it lighter using pressure. So I'm going to need to build by just going over and over in layers, and I'm going to need to be careful to start from the lighter areas and then gradually build the dark areas so that I don't make an error that I can't take away. So in this first box, I'm going to attempt some stippling. And what I'm going to do is start with some nice, evenly distributed fine dots. Now I'm going for more of an organic looking stipple, so I don't mind if my pen accidentally drags and gives the dot a little bit of a tail. I also don't mind if, as I start to now build towards my darker side of my box, I don't mind if they overlap. For me, that's going to help me to build the darker tone. But if you'd like to, you're most welcome to have more of a precise method of stippling. So now I'm really starting to concentrate my stippling process towards my darker area. And you'll notice pretty immediately that this is a very, very labor-intensive process, like we were talking about before. So it's really important that when you do this, you're in a comfortable position. Sprains and strains are a really common workplace injury in our industry. And so if you're doing this at an easel, making sure you're not hunching your back or having to stretch. And if you're doing this on a table, also make sure you're sitting comfortably because you're likely to be doing this for quite a while. And every now and then I'm just sort of sitting back from it and taking a look at my progress so far. So if you watch the smooth rendering video, you might remember that tonal work is all about relationships in art making. So we need the relationships between our darkest dark and our light to be correct. And if they're not correct, I'm not going to achieve the desired effect that I'm going for. I'm not going to be able to create a realistic sense of 3-dimension. And so what I'm doing, even though I'm just shading a box and just wanting to make a gradient, is I'm making sure that I can really clearly see a progression from my darkest darks through my midtones to my white. What's likely to happen to you, and I can see that it's happening to me right now, is that now I've got my really dark and my really light light. But I've been a little bit afraid of my midtones here, again, because it's hard to take back once you build up. So I'm going to have to come in now and kind of try and make them a little bit more dense in the middle area. That's already looking a little bit better. There's probably still more building that I could do moving forward from here. I'm not going to make you sit and watch me do that though. We're going to move straight on now to the next method, which is circling. And now in terms of circling, there's kind of two ways that I can approach this. So I'm going to draw a little line here to divide the two. The first method is going to be by creating little overlapping circles and lifting my material between each one. So each time I place one down, I'm lifting my hand up to place the next one. And this is really helpful because, like stippling, then I can control how far apart they are, how closely intertwined or how loosely intertwined they are to show tonal variation. But if I wanted to, I could also try this technique where it's more of a continuous line circling. So I'm not lifting my pen off the page. And in order to build in this process, I would need to start from the darkest dark and then kind of start to trail off gradually. I'm also pressing less firmly on my pen, and that'll help me to create a tonal gradient. And so what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to try this one down the bottom. I'm going to try this one down the bottom today because for me, I'm feeling like I have a little bit more control using this method over how dark, medium, and light my circling is. So I'm going around and around in circles, and I'm keeping in mind that this is a controlled and a tight method. In a minute, we're going to be playing with some scribble, and scribble's going to be very, very loose. We're going to let go of the need for control a little bit. But here I can still really maintain quite a bit of control over what I'm doing. And as I'm approaching my lighter section, I'm deciding for myself that I'm not going to be able to continue the continuous line method. I'm going to have to combine the two. I'm going to have to lift to create that circling in a way which makes it feel like it's trailing off towards the edge. And again, mine is a loose and an organic version of this, but yours could be much more particular, much more tidy if you wish for it to be. All right, so I've got some circling. Now I'm going to try scribble. Now, in my box for scribble, I've got to keep in mind that it's really important I don't make too much of a pattern. So for my scribble, I want it to feel random. I want it to feel loose and organic. I don't want it to feel controlled like my circling. So I'm going to avoid trying to do that same loop-to-loop thing as much as I can. And I'm going to really focus hard on going in different directions that I haven't gone before as I do this. Now that's more challenging than it sounds because our brains love patterns. We really do love and adore patterns. We want everything to have a bit of a rhythm and a process. So you're going to have to pay careful attention to what you're doing. Try and catch yourself out if you're starting to make a pattern. So I'm going to be completely random. Sometimes I'm going to lift, sometimes I'm going to use a continuous line. And you'll notice that I'm not even confined necessarily by the box. And so how I could apply this to a drawing project is, maybe I was doing this with a portrait. And what I could do is I could stick to the boundaries somewhat and stick to the tonal values quite accurately to create a realistic portrait. But then what I could do is I could exit the boundaries of the face and have this face that seems to trail off into patterns in the distance, which would be quite interesting and exciting. So again, I'm building in layers and layers. Until I've got a little bit of a gradient. Now I could still catch myself then leaning kind of into this circling. So what I could do to start to break that is I could start to introduce maybe some zigzagging. So force yourself to select a new pattern if you're finding yourself creating them. So now I've got these two boxes down here, and in these ones, I'm actually going to invent a brand new way of applying tone. And in the first one, I think I'm feeling quite inspired by circling. I think I'm going to try picking a shape to create a pattern with. And in my case, I think I'm going to try and choose some triangles. So I'm having a little test patch over here on the side. And I'm overlapping my triangles. And already I can feel that this is really hard. This is really hard for my brain not to turn into also circling. And they do already look quite similar, but let's have a go anyway and see how it turns out. And I'm really quite comfortable with the fact that my experiment today might fail. That's really is just a part of the art making process. Every time you fail, hopefully you're actually having a little bit of a celebration for yourself because you're going to be one step closer to finding a solution. You can rule something out. You might have learnt something new, even just through the process of failing that maybe you can apply to another artwork. So none of this experimentation is time or effort wasted. I'm starting to get a feel for whether I want to do a continuous line method and release pressure or whether I want to approach this like the stippling. And in my case, I'm feeling like approaching this more like the stippling is most appropriate. And as you get more experience at inventing these for yourself, you'll start to also figure out what your preference is and how you like to build this sort of tone. All right, and again, I could continue to work into that, but for now, I'm feeling like I've got the idea. And what I'm also starting to think about in my head as I'm inventing a new one is what sort of texture this might be useful for. So this speckled one up here, it really gives me the feeling of maybe a speckled bird's eggshell, or perhaps paws or freckles in the skin. This circling one here, this really gives me the impression of maybe tight, short, curly hair, or perhaps brambles, shrubbery. This very loose one here, and this makes me think of all sorts of things to do with, again, fur, string, lots of different concepts. This triangular one, this almost feels a little bit maybe reptilian, like it could help me to form an impression of some scales, perhaps. And now in my last one, I think I'm feeling like doing maybe some little squiggles. So I don't want it to look like hatching or cross-hatching or directional lines. I really do want it to look like squiggles. And so I might even do some quite organic shapes rather than sticking to straight lines as well to form this. So there's my test patch. I'm happy with my test patch. It does read quite a lot like Scribble, but that's okay. I guess I'm going to try and make a little bit more of a controlled version of this Scribble. So paying attention to going in different directions and not falling into the trap of using straight lines. I really want to remember to wiggle them as I go. So as you're watching me, I would encourage you, rather than trying these ones that I'm inventing now, I would encourage you to invent your own as well. Hopefully these sorts of processes will really inspire you to explore some experimentation. All right, there I go. And that's starting to feel maybe like some little trails left by insects in a tree, perhaps. Or again, maybe some sort of a hair texture or even like a woven texture of some description. There's lots of different ways that I could start to think about applying this to my own work. Now let's flick back very quickly to our presentation and talk about the next activity. So we've invented a technique. You could even do a few if you were feeling really inspired. We've tried circling, we've tried scribbling, and we've tried stippling. Now what we're going to do is apply our skills to a subject. So for this activity, you're going to need to select a subject. That could be a really simple object, a really simple landscape. Any of those sorts of things are great. So anything of your choosing, and you're going to draw the basic construction to start with. You can choose whether you'd like to use shadow shaping. If you're not familiar with shadow shaping, go back and review the smooth rendering video. So you could either apply that shadow shaping, or you could actually choose just to start with the construction as your base and to go from there. And if you've not yet mastered construction, you may like to use the example image provided on the next slide. Once you have completed your construction, select your preferred tone application technique from the last activity, or maybe even one or two, and begin applying this to your subject matter in a medium of your choice. And remember as you do this that if you don't feel confident, it's okay to build gradually, especially for mediums like fine line pen. So normally I would recommend starting from the dark tones and traveling towards the light so you don't taint those light areas. But in the case of fine line pen, it might actually be beneficial to gradually work your way from light through your midtones to your dark. You can kind of select what feels most natural for you. So here's the base image of a tree that you can use for yourself when you do this activity. It's got a little bit of hatching and cross-hatching left on it from a previous demonstration, but that's actually really fantastic for my purposes today because it's going to give me a little bit of a guide as I start to apply some of these other techniques. Rather than introducing pen and making this a mixed media work, I'm going to now swap to my 8B pencil. Here I've got a woodless graphite pencil, and I'm going to start to build with the same medium so that it will feel all quite natural and harmonious. And I think in this case, I might try and combine several of these techniques that we've played with. In particular, though, I really feel like Scribble. for this drawing is going to be quite nice. Scribble and circling in particular, again, to create feelings of shrubbery, feelings of organic lines in the bark. That's going to be what I'll go for. And I'm going to start light and just really explore the form as I do my scribble, because that is what scribble's all about. It's about exploration. And I'm starting light and just kind of getting a feeling for it first. I might still keep in mind some of my techniques like directional lines. So wrapping lines around to help to describe the three-dimensional form of a branch. In particular, I can also use some scribbles, some flicks to create the feeling of some plants growing down here at the bottom near the trunk. And even though I'm trying to let go of some control here, I still might make some choices about what I do and don't think is successful. So I might erase some of this. I feel like they're two all the same length over here, and I want them to be a little bit more random. So I'm coming in and I'm just cleaning that up a little bit. And I might also start to approach some of the shrubbery with some tighter circling here as well. And as I do this, I'm going to keep in mind some of my rules of atmospheric perspective. So the rules of atmospheric perspective, they dictate that normally, in most cases, as things go away from us into the distance, they're going to get lighter. They're going to get less in focus. They're going to become softer. If we were using color, they would also become bluer a lot of the time as well. And so I'm keeping in mind that if I want certain clumps of foliage to come forward and others to sit back, then I'm going to need to keep in mind how dark I'm building them and the amount of pressure that I'm wanting to apply. And I'm going to go for more of a tight circling with a continuous line in these dark areas. And then in some of these lighter areas, I'm going to be very loose again, and I'm going to tend more towards that scribble technique. What I'm probably going to end up with today is quite a playful illustrative style, perhaps. So this might be the sort of squiggly tree that I might want to feature in maybe a children's book illustration. Yeah, we're going for a very playful tree today. And I'm starting to get braver. You'll notice me getting a little bit more gestural and exploratory with my lines. And you'll probably find too that, you know, as you exit that really perfect initial drawing construction, you find a bit of a new sense of freedom. You feel a little bit more brave as you continue. It's really important as I do this that I don't lose sight of my tonal relationships. We're always, always, always going to come back to those tonal relationships. So I'm going to squint my eyes and ask myself, does this make sense? Am I happy with where my dark and my light is? I'm going to think about the direction of my light, which for me is coming from the left. So I'm definitely focusing my shadows around this side of the tree. And if I was using a reference image, or if I was drawing from life as well, I would be squinting not only at my drawing to take away some of that detail, blur my eyes on purpose and see just the tones. Not only would I be doing that to my drawing, but I would be doing that to the subject matter as well, to the actual tree itself. And what I'm also going to do, again, I'm going to come back in and be a little bit more selective. I'm going to disrupt it, in particular for a tree, because I'm going to probably have areas of dappled light that might come through the branches. So I don't want it to be, I guess, quite so perfect, even though it is scribble. I want it to be even less perfect. And then I can start to make them more organic shapes, because I'm not always going to have perfectly circular little spots of light coming through. They're going to vary. I might also sometimes see a little branch going through one of them, so I can think about that as well as I progress. I'm going to do some circling in here now on the branch and some general scribble. Maybe some more directional lines. And wow, look how much that's jumping out. So I'm thinking as well about my focus. So I can use these techniques, and I can use tonal work in general to pull and push things in and out of focus. And so I want to make sure that I have control over that rather than that controlling me. I'm being very, very deliberate about where I'm deciding I want to build. I'm really enjoying this particular area of complicated branches in here. And so that's why I'm allowing them to go quite this dark. It's because I'm wanting deliberately to draw my viewer's attention. Also, I'm really enjoying this knot in the tree. So I'm going to make some slightly more gestural marks around it. I'm going to build some more texture and interest in that bark in the tree. It's also really important to know when to stop. And I might have even overworked this a little bit. I could have probably stopped quite a few marks ago and still had a successful drawing. So I'm actually going to force myself to stop there and to decide that whether or not it's perfect, because I'm going for more of a playful and experimental tree, that's actually enough for me to get the sense of a tree. But in your own time, you can build as much as you'd like. When you're approaching this project yourself, spend a good amount of time on it. Don't overdo it, but also don't underdo it either. Don't fail to fully explore the capacity of these types of mark making. So here we have the references from today's images, if you'd like to go and take a look at some of these artists mentioned today further. And of course, the construction of the tree and other small diagrams are by myself. And let's now have a talk about what you can do next to reinforce these skills. As always, practice makes perfect. So you should choose one of these techniques to apply in your next art making project if it makes sense to and it's applicable for that project. You can also invent new ways of making marks, even more so than you have done today. And you should try and find some signature ones that are unique to your own practice. We really want to work on building your identity as an artist and your style. You can attempt an artwork where you use all of these techniques in different areas of the same image. See if you can still make a work which feels balanced, which doesn't feel too overwhelming, using as many of these techniques as you can. And you should also go and do a bit of an internet deep dive or go to your local library and see if you can find some artists of influence who use some of these techniques or who even invent new ones for themselves. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm wishing you all happy art making, and keep in mind that a potential long-term goal for you might be to go ahead and see if you can work your way up to using color. So here we have a pointillism example, but as usual, it's built from tiny, tiny dots. So it is stippled. This is oil on canvas by Sarah. And maybe you're wanting to build up to something similar to this, where you can combine a knowledge of basic color theory with the techniques that we've used today. I wish you luck. See you next time.